All right, let's get right into it. I want you to imagine a top-secret government document, a plan that, if it was ever approved, would have involved staging terrorist attacks against innocent Americans right here on U.S. soil, all just to create an excuse for a war. And look, this isn't some Hollywood movie plot. This was a real proposal, drafted by the highest levels of the U.S. military, and it had a name: Operation Northwoods. This one sentence, taken right from those declassified documents, tells you everything you need to know about the horrifying logic of this plan. The whole point wasn't just to create some incident, it was to create American victims. They literally wanted to generate a helpful wave of national indignation, basically an outcry from the public so huge that it would demand the U.S. go to war.
So you have to ask, who on earth would come up with something like this? Well, the answer is what makes this story so unbelievable. It wasn't some foreign enemy. It wasn't a rogue agency. No, this plan was written, signed, and unanimously approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most senior, most respected military leaders in the entire United States.
Now, to even begin to understand how this was possible, you've got to go back in time. We're talking about the early 1960s. The Cold War is at a fever pitch, and it really felt like the world was sitting on a powder keg. And right at the center of all that tension, a tiny island just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, Cuba. And things escalated so quickly. In 1959, Fidel Castro's revolution takes over Cuba. Just 2 years later, in '61, the CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion, which was supposed to overthrow him, fails miserably. It was a total disaster, a huge public humiliation for the U.S., and that failure, it lit a fire in Washington, creating this obsessive need to get rid of Castro, no matter what it took. So out of that desperation came something called Operation Mongoose. This was a massive, top-secret program involving the CIA, the Department of Defense, pretty much the whole shebang. And it had one single-minded goal: bring down Castro's government. Mongoose was the big umbrella project: sabotage, propaganda, you name it. Operation Northwoods was just one piece of it, arguably the most extreme and disturbing piece. So what was the actual plan? Well, the heart of the Northwoods document wasn't really a military strategy. It was a list of what they called pretexts, basically manufactured excuses, phony events, all designed to give the U.S. what looked like a legitimate reason to invade Cuba. They knew they needed a story that the American people would buy. And the strategy here was just pure, calculated deception. The plan itself says the goal was to make the U.S. look like the victim. They wanted it to seem like they were suffering these unprovoked attacks from a reckless Cuban government. That way, the U.S. could invade, and the rest of the world would see Cuba as the aggressor. And when you look at the specific ideas they came up with, it's just horrifying. I mean, this wasn't one single bad idea. It was a whole menu of them, a checklist of chaos. They talked about setting off bombs in American cities, faking hijackings, staging attacks on their own military bases, even sinking boats carrying Cuban refugees and blaming it all on Castro. Just look at this. This is the actual page from the declassified document. They explicitly, in writing, propose creating a new Remember the Maine incident. For anyone who doesn't know, that's a reference to the USS Maine exploding back in 1898, which was the event that kicked off the Spanish-American War. The Joint Chiefs wanted to literally run the exact same play: blow up one of our own ships and use the outrage to start a war. And maybe the most elaborate scheme of all involved a civilian passenger plane. The plan was to have a regular flight take off, then secretly land it at a secure base and swap all the passengers out. Meanwhile, a remote-controlled drone, painted to look exactly like the passenger plane, would take its place. That drone would then fly over Cuba, broadcast a fake Mayday call, and then be destroyed. Everyone would think Cuba just shot down a plane full of civilians. The level of detail is chilling. And it gets even weirder. There was a subplan called, I'm not kidding, Operation Dirty Trick. The idea was that if astronaut John Glenn's historic spaceflight ended in a disaster, they would just plant fake evidence to make it look like Cuba caused it through electronic interference. It really shows you that absolutely nothing was off limits. Okay, so you have this fully fleshed out, unanimously approved plan to attack American citizens. It goes up the chain of command, lands on the desk of the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, and is eventually shown to the president. What happens next? Well, this is the most important part of the whole story. And let's be crystal clear. This was an official proposal. You can see the cover sheet right here. It was signed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Lyman Lemnitzer. It had the full backing of the entire Pentagon leadership. They weren't just brainstorming, they were formally recommending that these operations move forward.
And what did President John F. Kennedy do? He shot it down. Completely. There was no debate, no let's think about it. He was reportedly just appalled that his own top military advisors would even dare to suggest something so fundamentally wrong. The answer was a hard no.
The fallout was incredibly fast. The plan gets presented on March 13th. Just 3 days later, Kennedy sits down with General Lemnitzer and tells him, point blank, that a war with Cuba is not happening. And a few months after that, Lemnitzer was not reappointed as chairman. He was quietly reassigned to a post in Europe. The plan and its biggest champion were done.
So after Kennedy rejected it, Operation Northwoods was effectively erased. It was buried in a classified vault somewhere in the Pentagon, and as far as the world was concerned, it never happened. It would stay a secret, totally unknown to the American people for decades. For 35 years. Just think about that. For 35 years, this document, this shocking piece of our own history, just sat there, hidden away from everyone.
So how in the world did a secret this big ever come out? Well, ironically, you can thank the Oliver Stone movie JFK. That film sparked so much public interest that Congress passed the law in 1992, forcing the government to release tons of assassination-related documents. And buried in all that paperwork, in 1997, the Northwoods memo was finally declassified, but nobody really noticed until author James Bamford wrote about it in his book in 2001. Then the story exploded.
So what do we make of all this today? The legacy of Operation Northwoods is really complicated because you can look at it in two completely different ways. On one hand, you could say the system worked, right? The civilian president stood up to the military and stopped a terrible idea in its tracks. But on the other hand, it is a deeply chilling revelation that the most powerful generals in the country were not only willing, but eager to murder American citizens to achieve a political objective.
In the end, the story of Operation Northwoods is this really stark warning about what can happen when power is allowed to operate completely in the dark. Yes, this plan was rejected, but the fact that it even existed in the first place, that it was seriously proposed and signed, well, that leaves us with a pretty unsettling question. What other plans are still out there, buried in some vault, that we